Welcome to our deep dive, into the life and fall of Bashar al-Assad. We've got a ton of sources here,
Yeah.
like Wikipedia articles, news reports,
Yeah.
trying to paint a picture of this figure who was, really at the heart of Syrian politics for decades, right?
Yeah. And what a story it is.
Yeah,
I mean, so full of contradictions.
right.
This is a man who went from ophthalmologist in London to dictator in Damascus,
Yeah,
someone who sparked both hope and utter despair.
it's incredible.
So let's unpack it.
Yeah.
Let's get into the need-to-know info about Bashar al-Assad.
The first thing that really struck me was this,
Yeah.
Assad was an eye doctor practicing in London. Not exactly the typical training ground for a ruthless dictator, is it?
Not really, no. You'd expect, right?
Yeah.
Someone coming from a military background,
Right.
or at least a family steeped in Syrian power politics.
Right.
But Bashar wasn't even meant for this role. He was pulled back to Syria
Yeah.
when his older brother, the heir apparent, died suddenly.
Wow.
Yeah.
So talk about a sudden change of plans,
Right.
and to make things even more complex, he's following in the footsteps of his father.
Of course.
Hafiz al-Assad, who ruled Syria for 30 years. Was Bashar groomed for this?
Right.
Or was he just kind of thrown in the deep end?
Well, it's more like he inherited a system, right?
Okay.
Hafez had built his power on this network of loyalty,
Right.
often drawing from his own Alawite sect.
Okay.
So that's a minority religious group in Syria.
Okay.
So the question is, did Bashar inherit that same unwavering support, or was he already facing an uphill battle from the get-go?
Wait, hold on. You mentioned the Alawite sect. For those of us who aren't experts in Syrian religious groups,
Yeah,
could you explain a bit more about what that is and
Right.
why it mattered so much to Hafez's rule?
of course. So Syria has a complex religious landscape, and the Alawites, while a minority, held a disproportionate amount of power under Hafez. They were favored in the military and government, which created resentment among some other groups. So Bashar inheriting this system meant inheriting its tensions too.
Okay. So that's a crucial point, right?
Yeah.
Just understanding those underlying dynamics at play.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now let's fast forward to Bashar's early presidency.
Okay.
Our sources describe something called the Damascus Spring,
Hmm.
this period of kind of cautious optimism and talk of reform.
Right.
Was this a genuine attempt at change, or was this all kind of smoke and mirrors?
Yeah, it's easy to get swept up in the hope of those early days, right?
Right.
I mean, there was talk of democracy, increased freedoms, even an amnesty for political prisoners.
Wow.
But if you look closer, the Syrian state was already deeply entrenched in authoritarianism.
Right.
The system itself made real democratic change extremely difficult.
Okay, so the Damascus Spring was more of a thaw
Yeah.
than a full-blown spring.
It sounds like the regime was way more interested in control than actual change.
Oh, well, Assad's regime exemplifies a common pattern we see with authoritarian leaders.
Okay.
Using the promise of reform to consolidate power, they give just enough to appease the international community
Right.
and quell internal dissent, but never enough to genuinely threaten their control.
Oh, that's chilling.
Yeah.
And sadly, our sources show that things took a dark turn pretty quickly.
Yeah.
The Damascus Spring essentially froze over
Right.
with crackdowns and censorship
Yeah.
becoming the norm. And it seems like any hope for a more open Syria was
Huh.
really short-lived.
Yeah, the Damascus Spring shows the danger of mistaking cosmetic changes for genuine reform.
Right,
The regime never relinquished its core grip on power.
right.
And crucially, this period also reveals something about Assad himself.
Okay.
His willingness to use force to silence dissent.
Hmm.
It's a pattern we'll see again and again throughout his rule.
Now, to understand Assad's place on the world stage,
We need to talk about the 2005 assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri.
a major event
Huge, yeah.
sent shockwaves.
Yeah, throughout the region. What was Assad's role in all of this, according to our sources?
Well, the UN investigation into Hariri's assassination implicated high-ranking Syrian officials.
Wow.
Created a huge international scandal, with fingers even being pointed at members of the Assad family.
Really?
It marked a turning point in how the West viewed Assad's regime, increasing suspicion and distrust.
Okay, so he was already dealing with internal pressures.
Yeah.
Now he's got this international incident hanging over his head.
After,
And then in 2011,
yeah.
the Arab Spring uprisings erupt across the Middle East.
Of course, right?
And Syria is thrown into chaos. Could this be a moment where
Right.
people finally overthrow Assad?
Well, here's where we see the brutal reality of Assad's rule.
Okay.
While other Arab Spring protests demanded change,
Okay.
Assad responded with overwhelming force.
Really?
It's the moment everything spiraled into a full-blown civil war, a conflict that would have devastating consequences for Syria, the region, and the world.
It's heartbreaking to read about the Syrian civil war.
Yeah.
I mean, the sources paint such a grim picture.
Yeah.
You know, a massive refugee crisis, unimaginable destruction, and horrific human rights abuses.
Yeah.
The Assad regime is being accused of using chemical weapons, barrel bombs.
It's tough to read about.
It's hard to fathom.
It's important to remember that war crimes aren't just the actions of a few bad soldiers, right?
Right.
In the case of Syria, the evidence suggests a deliberate and systematic campaign of violence, orchestrated from the highest levels of government, with Assad at the very top.
And yet, despite all the condemnation, right, and the horrors unfolding, he somehow clung to power for years. How was that even possible?
That's where his allies come into play, right? Russia and Iran provided military and financial lifelines, enabling him to resist international pressure and continue his brutal crackdown on the opposition.
It's a tangled web of geopolitics.
Oh, absolutely.
That's for sure. To kind of grasp the brutality of the regime, I keep coming back to the story of Ali Ferzat.
Right.
He was a prominent Syrian cartoonist,
Yeah.
brutally attacked.
Yeah.
His hands were broken, sending a clear message to anyone daring to criticize the regime.
It's chilling.
Yeah.
Ferzat's story is a chilling reminder of the personal cost of dissent under a dictatorship.
Right.
But it also highlights a crucial question.
Okay.
Why didn't the Syrian protests succeed like they did in some other Arab Spring countries? Was it purely down to Assad's brutality, or were there other factors at play?
Now, that's a question I've always wondered about. It seems like there's so much more to unpack here.
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome back to our deep dive into the life and fall of Bashar al-Assad. And as we're digging deeper into these sources, it becomes clear that his story is deeply entwined with, you know, the global landscape after 9/11.
Right.
And the so-called war on terror.
Right. The world was a very different place back then. I mean, fear and uncertainty were everywhere, and it seems like Assad was, you know, pretty skilled at using that to his advantage, presenting himself as, like, a key ally in the fight against terrorism, despite the, you know, brutal tactics of his own regime.
It's a fascinating example of how geopolitics often trumps human rights.
Right.
You know, Western governments, especially the U.S., found themselves in a really difficult position.
Yeah.
I mean, they needed Assad's cooperation in the fight against groups like al-Qaeda.
Right.
But they were also aware of his regime's horrific human rights record.
It sounds like a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if that friend is a brutal dictator, right?
Yeah.
Did this lead to any compromises?
Well, our sources suggest that Western intelligence agencies sometimes turned a blind eye to Assad's abuses.
Wow.
And there are even allegations of collaboration in certain cases.
Really?
It raises some troubling questions about the lengths to which governments will go in the name of security.
So they were essentially playing with fire, hoping to control a dictator while also relying on him.
Right.
That seems incredibly risky, and in the end, it backfired spectacularly.
It did.
Assad's regime only became more repressive.
Right.
And the country eventually descended into a horrific civil war.
Exactly. And as the conflict escalated, it became clear that the Syrian civil war wasn't just an internal struggle, right? It drew in regional and global powers, turning it into a proxy war with incredibly high stakes.
It's mind-boggling to think about all the different players involved. I mean, our sources mention Russia, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United States.
All of the major players.
Each with their own agendas and goals. How did all of this impact the situation on the ground?
Imagine like a giant chessboard, but instead of pieces, you have real people.
Right.
Real lives being sacrificed for strategic advantage.
It's awful.
The involvement of these external powers fueled the conflict, making it even more brutal and complex.
And in the midst of all this geopolitical maneuvering, the Syrian people were caught in the crossfire.
Of course.
Suffering unimaginable losses. It's easy to forget that behind the headlines and the political calculations, there are real human beings.
Of course.
Whose lives were shattered by this war.
You're absolutely right. It's crucial to ground our understanding in the lived experiences of those most affected, right? Right. Our sources offer glimpses into these personal stories, stories of unimaginable loss, but also of incredible courage and resilience. We hear about doctors working tirelessly in makeshift hospitals, families risking everything to escape the violence, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things to help their neighbors and communities survive.
Their stories are a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of courage, our sources also highlight the incredible work of humanitarian organizations and aid workers,
of course,
who risked their lives to provide relief in the midst of this chaos.
Yeah, absolutely.
Groups like the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, the White Helmets.
Incredible people.
These individuals were beacons of hope in a sea of despair. They worked tirelessly, often in incredibly dangerous conditions.
Absolutely.
To provide medical care, food, shelter, and a glimmer of humanity to those caught in the crossfire. It's humbling to read about their dedication and selflessness. It makes you wonder, how did they manage to keep going day after day in the face of such overwhelming suffering?
I think it speaks to the power of compassion, right?
Yeah.
To the fundamental human instinct to help those in need, even when the situation seems hopeless. Their work is a testament to the best of humanity, a reminder that even amidst the horrors of war, there are always those who strive to make a difference.
Now, we need to address a truly horrific aspect of the Syrian conflict, the use of chemical weapons.
Yeah, it's a topic that chills me to the bone just thinking about it.
It's a crime against humanity.
It is.
A blatant violation of international law. Our sources provide chilling accounts of these attacks, describing the excruciating pain and indiscriminate death inflicted upon innocent civilians. Including children.
Yeah, it's hard to wrap my head around the depravity of it all.
From the Ghouta attack in 2013 to the Khan Sheikhoun attack in 2017, the evidence overwhelmingly points to the Assad regime as the perpetrator. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a deliberate and calculated strategy to terrorize the population.
It's crucial to understand that chemical weapons aren't just another weapon in a military arsenal. They are uniquely horrific in their impact, designed to inflict terror and indiscriminate suffering. Their use represents a crossing of a moral line that should never be tolerated.
And yet, despite international condemnation and limited military strikes against Syrian government targets, Assad continued to use these banned weapons.
They did.
What does that tell us about his regime and its utter disregard for human life?
It's a stark reminder that in some corners of the world, power is pursued and maintained through sheer brutality. The international community's response, while well-intentioned, ultimately proved insufficient to deter Assad's regime.
It raises a fundamental question. How do we as a global community prevent such atrocities? How do we hold those responsible accountable and ensure that chemical weapons are never used again?
It's a challenge that demands creative solutions, a renewed commitment to international cooperation, and perhaps a willingness to reconsider our traditional approaches to conflict resolution.
Now, let's shift our focus to another devastating consequence of the Syrian conflict. The refugee crisis. Millions of Syrians were forced to flee their homes, seeking safety and shelter in neighboring countries and beyond. It's hard to even grasp the scale of human suffering involved.
Imagine having to leave everything behind.
I know.
Your home, your community, your entire life.
It's awful.
And being forced to start over in a foreign land with nothing but the clothes on your back. That's the reality for millions of Syrian refugees.
It's heartbreaking, and these refugees are facing incredible challenges. Poverty, discrimination, trauma, and the uncertainty of ever being able to return home. What can be done to help them rebuild their lives?
It's a global challenge that demands a coordinated and compassionate response. We need to provide safe haven for those seeking asylum. Support their integration into new communities. And work towards creating conditions that will allow them to eventually return home safely and with dignity.
But returning home isn't as simple as just opening the borders, is it?
It's not.
Especially given the level of destruction and the deep-seated divisions that still exist in Syria.
You're right. It's a complex issue. Rebuilding a nation after a war of this magnitude requires more than just bricks and mortar. It requires addressing the root causes of the conflict, healing deep societal wounds, and creating a sense of justice and reconciliation.
And speaking of rebuilding, let's talk about the role of foreign fighters in the Syrian conflict.
Okay.
Our sources describe individuals from all over the world traveling to Syria to join various factions, both pro-government and anti-government.
Yeah.
What motivated these individuals to leave their lives
Yeah.
and join this brutal conflict?
It's a fascinating, albeit disturbing phenomenon.
Yeah.
Some were driven by ideology, right?
Right.
Drawn to the idea of fighting for a cause they believed in, whether it was establishing an Islamic caliphate or defending the Assad regime.
Right.
Others were motivated by a sense of adventure,
Right.
a thirst for violence, or a desire to escape personal problems.
So you have this mix of idealists, adventurers, and perhaps even some who were lost and seeking a sense of purpose, all converging in this chaotic war zone. What are the implications of this influx of foreign fighters?
The presence of battle-hardened fighters with extremist ideologies poses a serious security threat.
Right.
Not only to Syria,
Right.
but also to their home countries.
Wow.
It's a reminder that conflicts rarely remain isolated.
Right.
They can have ripple effects
Right.
that spread far and wide.
And speaking of ripple effects, we can't talk about the Syrian conflict without discussing Russia's role.
Of course not.
Their support for the Assad regime was a game changer, right? Allowing Assad to cling to power and ultimately crush the rebellion.
You could say that Russia's intervention was like throwing a massive weight onto one side of a seesaw.
Right.
It completely shifted the balance of power in Syria.
Right.
But their motives were complex.
Okay.
Driven by a desire to project power, counter Western influence in the Middle East, and secure their own strategic interests in the region.
So it was about much more than just propping up a friendly dictator.
Oh, yeah.
It was about Russia reasserting itself as a major player on the world stage.
Exactly. And they succeeded,
Right.
at least in the short term.
Yeah.
They helped Assad stay in power,
Right.
secured their military bases in Syria,
Right.
and projected an image of strength and decisiveness.
Wow.
But what are the long-term consequences of this intervention?
That's a question I don't think anyone can answer definitively right now.
It's hard to say.
But it's clear that Russia's involvement has had a profound impact on the Syrian conflict.
Absolutely.
And the ripple effects will continue to be felt for years to come.
Absolutely.
And it's important to remember that while we often focus on the geopolitical maneuvering and the actions of powerful states, at the heart of this conflict are the Syrian people.
Right.
They are the ones who have borne the brunt of the violence, the displacement, and the loss. Their stories, their resilience, and their hopes for a better future must remain at the forefront of any discussion about Syria.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Bashar al-Assad. You know, it's been a wild ride, hasn't it?
It has.
I mean, from London eye doctor to dictator clinging to power through a brutal civil war.
Right.
And now the sources paint a picture of Syria facing a very, very uncertain future.
Right. The fall of a dictator doesn't automatically equal peace and democracy.
All right.
In fact, our sources describe a nation grappling with this immense task of rebuilding.
Yeah.
After more than a decade of war, cities are in ruins, the economy's shattered, and deep sectarian divisions remain.
Right.
Toppling Assad was just the first step in a very, very long journey.
Okay, so where do we even begin? The sources talk about a fragile peace,
Yeah.
but there are rebel groups vying for power.
Right.
Neighboring countries still meddling in Syrian affairs.
Of course.
It sounds like a recipe for chaos.
Like a classic power vacuum scenario,
Yeah.
right? The question is, who will fill that vacuum?
Right.
And will it be done through cooperation or more violence?
Right.
It's a high-stakes game with internal factions, external powers, and even the risk of extremist groups trying to exploit the situation.
Our sources mention the international community scrambling to respond,
Right.
with calls for a UN peacekeeping force and renewed efforts at diplomacy.
Yeah.
But I've got to be honest, after years of failed diplomacy in Syria,
Right.
I'm a bit skeptical. Is there any reason to think this time will be different?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
I think there's a recognition that past approaches haven't worked.
Right.
Simply throwing money or peacekeepers at the problem won't solve the deep-rooted issues that fueled the conflict in the first place.
So what needs to change?
Well, for starters, the international community needs to move beyond transactional politics.
Okay.
We can't just view Syria as a chessboard for geopolitical maneuvering.
Right.
We have to prioritize the needs and aspirations of the Syrian people. That means listening to a diverse range of voices, not just the loudest or the most powerful.
One of the things that really struck me in our sources is this deep-seated corruption that plagued Assad's regime. Can Syria truly transition to a more democratic and accountable system if they don't address this legacy of cronyism and self-enrichment?
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
Decades of corruption have eroded trust in government and created a culture of impunity. Rebuilding that trust and establishing a system based on the rule of law will require a major effort to root out corruption, hold those responsible accountable, and create a more transparent and equitable economic system.
That sounds like a Herculean task.
It is.
Especially given how deeply entrenched those corrupt networks were under Assad. Is there any reason to believe that real change is possible?
That's where I think the role of Syrian civil society becomes so important. Our sources describe a resilient and courageous civil society that has been working throughout the conflict to document human rights abuses, provide humanitarian aid, and advocate for democratic reforms.
So, despite all the suffering and the challenges, there's still hope for a better future.
Absolutely. The Syrian people have shown incredible strength and determination. They're not waiting for someone else to come and fix things. They're taking action, pushing for change, and holding those in power accountable. The international community needs to support and empower these local actors rather than trying to impose solutions from the outside.
Now, we can't talk about Syria's future without addressing the plight of the millions of refugees who fled the country during the war.
Of course not.
They're scattered across the region and beyond, living in limbo, longing to return home.
Of course.
What are the prospects for their safe and dignified return?
It's a complex and sensitive issue. While many refugees desperately want to go back, large parts of Syria are still unsafe. Basic infrastructure is lacking. And there's a real fear of retribution, especially for those who oppose the Assad regime.
So while Assad's gone, the scars of his rule remain.
Rebuilding trust and ensuring security will take time. And it's not just about physical reconstruction. It's about addressing the deep psychological wounds of war. The trauma, the grief, the fractured communities.
It sounds like the fall of Assad is just the beginning of another long and difficult chapter for Syria.
It is, but it's also a chapter filled with possibility. The Syrian people have shown incredible resilience. They have a deep-seated desire for a better future. And they're already working to create it. The international community needs to be a partner in this process, providing support and resources, but also respecting Syrian agency and leadership.
Well, this has been an incredibly eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
We've gone from the personal journey of one man to the complexities of a global conflict with far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. And the story isn't over. The future of Syria remains uncertain, but one thing's for sure. The Syrian people deserve peace, justice, and the chance to rebuild their lives and their country. It's up to all of us to support them in that endeavor.
That's a powerful message to end on.
It is.
Thank you for guiding us through this complex and often heartbreaking story.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue learning about Syria.
Absolutely.
Engage in informed discussions. And to consider how you can contribute to a more just and compassionate world.
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never lose hope for a better future.